In this video, we're going to take a look at the field of organizational behavior. What is organizational behavior? Where did it come from? And why is it important to me? And moreover, why is it important to you? These and many more questions will be answered. So, hang on as we go through an overview of organizational behavior. Now, according to our textbook, organizational behavior, the definition is drawing on psychology, sociology, political science, and cultural anthropology. Organizational behavior, or OB as it's known, is the study of the impact that individuals, groups, and organizational structure and processes have on behavior within organizations. Okay, so you see in that definition several important things. First of all, it's a multidisciplinary field. It borrows from psychology, from social psychology, which is the interaction, the way we behave in individuals, the way we behave as individuals with other people, in groups. Sociology, the larger context of human interaction in society. Political science, right? This idea of conflict and coalitions and vying for scarce resources. And anthropology. Well, what's anthropology have to do with organizational behavior? Well, we're going to get to an idea soon in this class about organizational culture, right? So there's a lot of different fields that are part of this this overall field of organizational behavior. So while it is a discipline in of itself, it's a bit of a, I don't want to say parasitic, that makes it sound negative, but it really incorporates a lot of things that we know from other scientific, social scientific domains. Now, another thing that organizational behavior is about is it's about looking at an organization at multiple levels. So as you can see from the disciplines involved in OB, it's necessary to look at what is going on, the organizational phenomena at different levels. So you can look at it from the psychological and the social psychological perspective as happening with a person or in between people or maybe groups of people, right? So that's one level. The next level is sort of that group dynamic. And once you begin to shift your focus from just one person to a group of people now, things become more complex. The dynamics change. You start to develop norms and values, the building blocks of culture within a group. And then an organizational level looks at even more complex phenomena. What is an organization? It's really a cluster of a bunch of different groups, right? So if you think about your church, or your nonprofit, or whatever sort of organization you're a part of, really at the end of the day, it's a bunch of groups, right, trying to work together. So OB helps us to sort of break down what's called the level of analysis. Where is the issue? And ultimately, what we're trying to do is we're trying to become better at what we do, right? And I'll talk about effectiveness in just a bit. This is a challenging one, especially in the church world, but the ultimate goal of OB is to improve performance and effectiveness of your organization, right? So whatever your mission is, whatever your goals are, whatever is important to you, organizational behavior can contribute to doing that better, all right? Now, why is it important to understand? And again, we all know this, that a church really is a bunch of people, right? We're trying to get along. We're trying to accomplish a mission. We're trying to accomplish the Great Commission. So if you're concerned about people, if you're concerned about how well these people cooperate effectively to carry out the mission of the church, then you want to be concerned with organizational behavior, because it has to do with people's feelings about the organization. It has to do with their commitment. It has to do with how motivated they are. It has to do with how well groups and teams function together. It has to do with the overall culture and the values of the organization. It has to do with the points of conflict and tension. It has to do with organizational stress and misbehavior. It has to do with change and innovation, and how do we get unstuck if we've been in a certain place for a long time. So the study of organizational behavior is important for church folks, because if we don't understand it, then we tend to gloss over and misinterpret and misunderstand and miss the mark on so many issues in the church because we're only looking at it through a theological lens. So there's nothing wrong with our theological lens, but I believe that it needs to be complicated some by adding the social lens, the human lens, the part of the church that involves people in our humanity, right? And all our dignity and all our glory that God has made us. And you might be saying, well, man's fallen, that doesn't count, right? Yeah, we are fallen, but still, God has made us a certain way. He's given us certain desires and instincts that aren't necessarily sinful, right? For example, let me just give you an example here. The desire to be affirmed and acknowledged, right? We all want to be affirmed. We all want to be acknowledged. Well, organizational behavior deals with this in the topic of motivation, right? So we motivate people by affirming them and helping them to achieve and become all that God has them to be. Now, is that an evil thing that people want to achieve and they want to be acknowledged? No, it's not. I think it's a very human thing. So as church leaders, we have to understand the human dynamic behind a lot of the issues that we deal with. All right? So enough said on that. And that's why I believe it is important for church leaders, right? Okay, so let's talk about some of the background and the development of OB from some of the other earlier sources of academic study. Now, there was a guy named Max Weber, I think is the correct pronunciation. And he was a German sociologist, and he was asked by the King of Prussia to help him organize the army, right? So think about an army for a second. You've got a lot of complexity. You've got a lot of different ranks. You've got thousands and thousands, maybe even 100,000 of people. You've got dispersed all over the world. You've got a mission, right? You've got all the technology. And so the task of organizing an army is pretty daunting. And so Weber came in and he set up what are now called the rules of bureaucracy. Now, hang on for a second, because I know as soon as you hear that term bureaucracy, you start to think of things like, red tape and, the Department of Motor Vehicles and, just kind of, endless getting through systems, right? And getting dropped off the phone tree, right? So that's not, in Weber's original explanation of bureaucracy, it didn't have to do with that. There's some simple rules behind a bureaucracy. For example, there's an office, right? An office, not a physical office, but a role that a particular person in an organization occupies. There's a chain of command. There's policies, there's rules that regulate the behavior of people, right? So this is one of the first attempts at really managing a complex, large-scale organization. Now, then came along a guy named Frederick Taylor, and Taylor was considered the father of what's called scientific management. Now, scientific management kind of took Weber just another step further and said, can we evaluate what leads to productivity? Can we see how people work? Can we observe them? Can we improve productivity by changing certain processes, right? So this was kind of the first attempt to really look at things scientifically and analytically to improve performance and production in organization. And then a guy named Henri Fayol came along and developed what's referred to as administrative management. And these are some of the basic rules. And again, today, this doesn't seem very, groundbreaking. It seems very second nature. But he was one of the first guys that began to articulate things such as planning and budgeting and staffing, right? Chain of command. Some of these ideas in a very logical way. Today we're like, yeah, of course there has to be planning, there has to be budgeting, there has to be goal setting, there has to be reporting, right? And then Mary Follett came along, and she was one of the first people who really saw the deficiency in some of this thinking, because while it led to productivity, it didn't really understand the human side of organizations, right? Because what did we say? An organization is a bunch of people, right? And so if you want to get the best out of if you want the organization to be the best, you have to get the best out of people. So Mary Follett Parker, excuse me, I misspoke earlier. was one of the first management scholars who really realized that we need to focus and understand what makes people tick, right? And how to get the best out of people and people's human needs. Now, it's interesting, right? This is kind of an aside that it took a woman management scholar, right, to sort of bring some of these things out. And it kind of makes sense. We sort of know, I don't want to step on anybody's toes, but we know that women are relational, right? They're more sensitive to feelings, oftentimes, than us dense men. And so a woman made a profound impact early on in the organizational field of organizational behavior by identifying this deficit. Now, the problem with Parker was she didn't have any data, right? It was kind of a theory, it was a good theory, but it never really took off because she didn't have any empirical evidence or data to support her ideas. So along comes the Thorn Studies, right? And these were done at the Western General Plant, and they were studying large groups of employees, and they wanted to see what would make them more productive. And so they would change things in the environment. They would change the lighting. They would change the way the tables were arranged. And one of the things that they noticed, or probably the most profound thing that they noticed, was that production improved in certain areas, not because of some of these physical layout changes, but because the women who were doing the work were actually involved in some of the decisions, right? This was an unintended consequence. So they didn't realize that by getting the people, getting the workers involved in the decision making, that could improve performance. Now again, today that seems kind of like duh, right? But back then it was kind of a breakthrough, and this was really the first time they had evidence to validate some of Mary Parker Paulette's earlier theories, right? So they had evidence to show that productivity went up. Now, a side note, you've probably heard of the Hawthorne effect. Maybe you remember that from your Psych 101 class. But that's sort of the idea of unintended consequences and the ramifications of entering into a situation. So, for example, the researcher entered into the situation. He now became a new variable in the experiment, so to speak, and so it changed the outcome, right? That's what's called the Hawthorne effect, sort of the unintended consequences of introducing a third party, so to speak. All right, just a little nerdy side note right there. You probably want to know. Now, the textbook does point out that, you know, in time, in retrospect, the Hawthorne studies may have not been perfect. They may have been flawed, as a lot of the early studies were. And nevertheless, it was really sort of a turning point in management studies, and it really led to what's called the human relations movement. Now, this isn't the same thing as your HR department at work, you know, where they cut your paychecks and take care of your benefits. Human relations movement in management meant that it's important to understand the human dimension, how people interact with one another and with the organization in order to improve performance. So it was kind of a turning point, right? It was really a turning point in the whole field of management studies, and, you know, you could say sort of led to this field of organizational behavior that we're interested in now. Another important kind of foundational idea in this whole field here. Okay, so now we know where it came from. So let me give you some specific kinds of topics within the field of OB. Really, not topics within it. We're going to look at the topics later, but sort of some foundational groundwork kind of issues, okay? So the first one is systems theory, all right? Everybody repeat that after me. Systems theory. All right, what does that mean? Well, if you look in your textbook, you'll see a nifty little diagram that shows inputs, it shows a process, and it shows an output. And encircling that whole thing is the environment, right? Okay, so you got input, the process of changing the inputs into outputs, and then all of these things take place in the environment. All right, so let's take an example for us church leaders, right? What are our inputs? You know, maybe people in the congregation, right? People that come in. What are the processes? Whatever we do to disciple, we teach, we mentor, we coach, we correct, you know, all the things that we do, we counsel, and what's the output? Hopefully nice, squeaky, clean disciples, right? People that go out and make disciples themselves, right? So that's kind of our systems, our little system within a church, right? But then you also have the environment, right? So the environment aspect of system says that, you know, this is going to influence who comes into the system, right? So let's just say you're a church in the inner city. who's going to come into the system? Well, it's probably going to be poor people. You're probably going to have, a lot of issues, maybe crime issues. What if you're in an affluent suburb? Who's going to come into the system? A lot of soccer moms, business people, things like that, right? Okay, so that's going to change. And then when they go out, they're also going to influence the system, right? Now, another thing to know about, so that's kind of the meta view of system, but there's also sort of a micro view of systems that's important as well. Because remember we said earlier that an organization, one level of analysis is by looking at groups. So if you think about a group as a system, right? Or a subsystem, if you will, right? So all of the groups in your church, for example, are a subsystem. Your youth group, your women's group, your children, your outreach, your executive staff, right? Your volunteer team, all the different groups that you've got going on are a system, and they all work within a similar environment, right? And they're all going to interact through each other. And I think what's important about this idea is that sometimes we say, well, I'm just going to make a change over here, I'm going to make a change over here, but we don't realize that they're all interconnected. They're all part of the same environment. And so a change in one part of the system is going to impact another part of the system. So for example, let's just say you have somebody working in the children's ministry who's very influential, very sharp, everybody likes that person, they're well respected, and then one day they leave. And you might be saying, well, that's no problem, I'll just get another children's department leader, I'll just do that. And you get somebody else, but what you realize in time was that a lot of other things are beginning to change. Balls are getting dropped. Other people are leaving, right? Things are just not the same anymore since that person left. So you were kind of thinking in terms of a bureaucratic approach. I'm just going to take this cog out, I'm going to replace it with this other cog, right? Well, the problem is people aren't cogs, and because organizations are systems that influence each other, the change of that person now had influence over other parts of the system, right? Let's just say you decided to add another service or take away another service or try a new outreach or try a new... All these things you do don't happen in isolation. They have a larger impact on the overall system, okay? So systems thinking is important because it makes us realize that changes influence, right, a lot of other parts of the system, okay? Let's talk about this idea of outputs for a second. Now, this is a little bit tougher in the church world, right? Because we don't have a product per se, right? We are in the business of making disciples. That is our product, right? Disciples are our product, right? People who follow Jesus and who go make other disciples. That's our product. Now, the challenge in the church is, how do we demonstrate that we're being effective? How do we demonstrate we're accomplishing our mission? And I'm going to let you think about that for a second. If that's our mission, making disciples, how do we know that we are being effective? How do we know that we're doing what we're supposed to be doing? Now, I know the wheels are spinning and you're wondering, okay, I'm going to tell you here. And maybe you already came to this cynical conclusion yourself, but really the way traditionally, for better for worse, we've determined the effectiveness of a church is by how much people are giving, right? Are they tithing? And maybe we break it down to tithing per family or tithing units. It's kind of a funky term somebody came up with back in the day, but how much per person or per family is being given. And we also measure how many people attend our Sunday services, right? Okay, so it's the classic nickels and noses. That's how we measure effectiveness in a church, or historically that's been the way that it has been measured. But let me ask you something. Is that really determining whether or not we're being effective in our mission of making disciples? Okay, is there an answer here? There's no clear-cut answer, but what I want to do is I want to complicate your thinking. I want to challenge your thinking about how you determine whether or not you are being effective. Because organizational behavior is about improving the effectiveness of an organization, even a church, right? So we have to get more nuanced and complicated in the way we think about what we're doing, right? So maybe nickels and noses is sufficient for you, but maybe you want to think about other alternative ways to determine whether or not you are being effective. So, for example, can we determine discipleship right? Can we determine, discipleship? Can we look at things like leadership growth and opportunities for participation? Because think about it, if it's all about nickels and noses, you could say something like, well, the Mormon church is the most effective, church in the world because they've got more money and more meeting places than just about anybody else. Or the other logical conclusion of the nickels and noses is saying, well, really the end goal is for all of us is to be a megachurch. We all need to be, 30,000 people and, millions and millions of dollars and running all these programs and really nice facilities and, well-paid staff, right? That's the goal. That's the measure of success. But I don't know. Between you and me, and my guitar hanging up there on the wall, I don't think that's it. I think the megachurch phenomena is wonderful. It serves a lot of people, but I don't think that's the ultimate determination of effectiveness in the kingdom of God. So I want to challenge you guys right off the beginning here to think about what is it that is the hallmark that shows that you are being effective in your mission besides nickels and noses, right? So look for other things. And here's another important distinction I want to make up front too. This idea about organizational behavior, the challenge we have for a church is that OB really is focused on the organization itself, right? So the leadership, the middle management, right, the staff, all those kinds of people, employees, right? But in a church, our dynamic's a little bit different. So we typically have a pastor, we have a pastoral staff maybe. If we're large, we have many pastors, we have the administrative infrastructure, right? And then we have kind of frontline people, and we have a lot of volunteers, right? We have a lot of volunteers. Most churches run with the help of a lot of volunteers. Now, who are volunteers? Well, volunteers are kind of like your customers in a sense, right? They're also the same people that are attending Sunday morning. So what you see here is you got an interesting dynamic. Apple or anybody else, they're a very closed system and they've got lots of customers, right? But the church is a bit like, well, the people are the system in a sense, right? They're an integral part of the system. So the challenge is, and you don't have to, but conceptually, we need to think a little bit differently about organizational behavior when we're talking about church. Primarily, we want to look at the people within, right? So we're talking about the staff, pastoral staff, the administrative infrastructure, and those sorts of people, right? Okay, so just another way to complicate your thinking here and to show you some of the challenges of OB in a ministry context. What else do I want to talk about? Another interesting thing about systems is this idea that the environment, right? So let's talk about the environment just a little bit more here. If you kind of use an evolutionary metaphor, and I'm not, saying that I believe in evolution of mankind. I believe we're all, uniquely created in the image of God. But if you take this idea that, that things change, that things grow, that things adapt over time, right? Okay, so think about an organization. Organizations grow, change, and adapt. And there's this other idea of organizational life cycle, right? So we tend to grow and then plateau and then decline. So this idea of the environment and the life cycle of an organization, think about the life cycle of a church. So you might be at that beginning, excited, hey, we're all gung-ho, we're kind of growing, or you might be at that, we're kind of holding steady, or you might be at that, hold on, we're going down for a crash landing here. So it's important to identify the place that you are in the organizational life cycle and act appropriately. Say the way leadership acts, the way organizational behavior is thought about is going to be different depending on where you are in the organizational life cycle. All right. Some other issues here that impacted OB over the years is what was called the quality movement. And a guy by the name of Deming back in the 80s, went over to Japan and saw the phenomenal growth that was happening there. And they noticed that they did a lot of work on improvement, right? They brought people together and say, how can we improve our process? How can we improve, our little aspect of the organization? And so this commitment to quality to micro improvement, right? So to changing things incrementally over time and using data to improve as well. And so quality has become a top priority for growing organizations. So think about any organization, business that you like. Think about the products that you use. Maybe you're a Google fan, or maybe you're an Apple fan, or maybe you're, Amazon fan, or you're a Dell computer fan, or, a Nike fan, or whatever, product or service that you use on a regular basis. You've probably seen how these things have gotten better and better over time, right? Now, can churches do that? Can churches be concerned about quality? Can they use data to improve, to become better over time? I think they can, right? So this idea of quality means we're pay attention to how well things are done. We use data, right? Not just our hunches. Now, our hunches are good starting points, but the quality movement really has to do with can we measure the improvement. So we might have a hunch about something, then we might measure the baseline. So let's just say we have a hunch that, let's give you kind of a basic, silly example, but we have a hunch that a lot of the people that come to our services, go to Starbucks before they come to church, and it's causing them to be late, and so they rush in with their coffee. So somebody says, "Hey, why don't we start our own, coffee ministry? We'll start it." And so we start to offer coffee, right? Does that improve the attendance? Do people show up on time? Is the congregation more full, right? Do they appreciate it? Do they like the additional service? And a lot of churches now have little coffee shops going on there. Okay, so there's a way you can kind of take a hunch, measure it, and then implement a solution, and then remeasure to see if it's any better. So, anyhow, attention to quality is an important factor in growing organizations today. Some other terms associated with OB are things like productivity, right? Are we producing what we say we're producing? Is it a good product? Efficiency, right? Are we spending our money wisely? Are we wasting money on things? Is there redundancy, right, of personnel? Satisfaction, right? And satisfaction usually has to do with the internal stakeholders, i.e. your staff, your paid personnel. Are they satisfied? Are they happy? Do they like working here? Are there opportunities for them? Are they growing? If you have like a back door and you have staff that are leaving and you have this high attrition, a lot of turnover, that's never a good thing, right? So you've probably got low satisfaction at that point. So these are some of the issues that OB can help you identify and deal with, are things like low satisfaction and turnover, right? And people showing up late and, all these kinds of things. Adaptiveness is another concept. Can we change? And it's no secret, right? The world has changed a lot in the last, 30 years. And so if you're still doing church today the way you were doing it even 10 years ago, 20 years ago, you're probably not adapting. And any organization that begins to decline, remember we talked about that life cycle, if you're on the decline here, chances are you're not adapting to new environmental realities. And so this idea of changing, adapting to the environment, changes in the culture are important. And then the other idea here is development. This is an important issue in organizations today. How intentional and how well are we developing our people? Are we helping train people at all levels, right? So we talk about leadership development. That's one aspect, right? So it's important to help executive level folks to develop, right? But other people as well, middle management, frontline staff, volunteers, wherever you got people, right, who have an impact on the organization, there needs to be a focused attention on their development. So OB is cognizant of that and contributes to that kind of ongoing development cycle of organizations. All right, so I'm just going to talk about one more thing here. You're probably getting tired of hearing me talk. I'm getting tired of hearing me talk, all right? So let me just mention a couple other factors, or what are called environmental forces that are influencing organizations today, okay? And see if you can relate to any of these. Maybe you can, maybe you can't. It kind of depends. Number one is globalism, right? We live in a globally connected world. even a church, right? You've got people doing missions trips. You've got people coming into your church from all over the world now. Maybe your communities look a lot different than they did. This idea of globalism, the globally connected world. Diversity is another important factor, and this might be related to point number one, but we're starting to realize that the homogenous organization doesn't exist anymore. Unless you live in a really kind of insular community, that's okay, but a lot of folks are ministering in very diverse, multicultural kinds of communities, and so we can't make the same kind of assumptions about people. They're all not going to look like me or you, right? They're going to be a lot different. Speed of change. This is another reality in our culture, and I think all these things are connected in a way, but things change. And again, we need to be, circumspect and look at how we do things in our organizations on a regular basis, because, things are changing so quickly. The psychological contract has changed. Now, what is the psychological contract? It's sort of this implicit idea people have in their heads when they come to work for you about what it's going to be like. They're not going to say this, but this is what they think, right? And if you think about your own experience, you'll validate this. They want a place that's loyal to them. They want a place that treats them well. They want a place that pays them regularly, right, if it's a salary position. They want a place that has some opportunity for advancement and for growth, for challenging things, right? They want to be appreciated, right? Okay, so this is a psychological contract. And on the other hand, the employer, the organization, wants loyalty. They want hard work. They want people to show up. They want people not to leave unexpectedly, right? So there's these kind of unspoken assumptions that each party has towards each other. Now, this psychological contract is changing, especially with a lot of more millennials coming into the workforce and your Gen Z folks getting ready to come into the workforce, right? So they have different expectations. So you might be a boomer manager who has a bunch of millennial employees, right? And if you're in that situation, you're probably saying, oh, yeah, I've seen there's a lot of difference in expectations, right? So dealing with the difference in expectations and, accommodating different people, right? So you might be a boomer manager and say, man, these millennials are driving me crazy. Well, maybe you need to adapt and learn how to manage them more effectively, and instead of letting them get under your skin or proving that you're or assuming that your boomer management style, and approach to life is going to be effective with these folks, right? Okay, so I'm not dissing anybody here, but I'm just talking about how things are changing and how we need to become a little more complicated in the way we deal with the changing world and the expectations that people come into organizations. And then last but not least is technology, right? So technology impacts organizations. For example, people work at home. There's a distributed workforce. You can get people working from you from all over. A lot of people are using technology in churches now to broadcast services, right? So you might have that model of the hub church and the campuses, and they're all watching the same sermon. Maybe they have different worship teams, right? So technology now has literally changed. This has led to a huge church growth model, this campus-based church, right? It's become very popular. All facilitated by technology. 20 years ago, you couldn't do it. You didn't have the technology, you didn't have the bandwidth, all these kinds of things that make these things possible. Social media, right? The rise and the spread of social media all impact, the way we do church, the way we promote church, the way we get visibility, right? So think about technology, how it's changed a lot of things that you do, the way your staff communicate with each other, just email, right? I mean, it's been around for a while now, but that's a basic technology we all assume, we take for granted, that's going to impact the way we interact with each other. All right. Well, I've given you guys a lot. Hopefully this was helpful. It's kind of a review of the book, but also kind of adding some of, a little bit of a Christian element, a church element that you're not going to get in the book. So let me just say a word about that. The book is great. The examples may not be as relevant to you if you're in a ministry role. If you're in a business context, they probably will. Some are nonprofit and other kinds of organizations related. But please do read them. Read the case studies, the little sidebars. I think you'll find them interesting and relevant to you no matter what kind of organization you're in. So anyhow, that is it. I hope you feel well informed and introduced to this field of organizational behavior, and we will see you next time.